Hey everyone, we are live now with our weekly office hours, talking about some CSS pseudo elements today. Before we dive right in, let me introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Brian Robinson. I'm a veteran of the web industry for about 12, 13 years now. I've been doing primarily CSS, JavaScript, HTML, that front end stuff in that time. And I'm now running my own company, Code Contemporary, where I provide tutorials, writing, courses for front-end developers looking to do things in the modern way. So grab some tea, grab some coffee. I've got some tea right here. We're going to go through some information on pseudo elements. I've got a poll up on here. You can click that info card to take the poll and let me know if you've ever used before and after in production, or any pseudo element that kind of goes with this. So I want to also say, before I get started, if you have any questions that either don't relate to pseudo elements or just you want to make sure you get them answered today, go ahead and put them in the chat over on the right hand side of your screen, so that I've got them for later, because there is some delay between the YouTube feed and what I see. So that kind of had some awkward time last week. I muted my mic. It was great. So I also have a cat with me today. She's going to be mewing various times, so I apologize about that. But I have no doors in my office, so she'll wander in and out and probably knock some stuff off my desk as we go along. So let's go ahead and dive in. I have a nice blank code pen here, and after we're done here today, I'll make sure to put in the comment a link directly to this code pen. And we're going to start talking about just the bare minimum basics of what a pseudo element is. You've probably heard, or at least seen somewhere along your way, CSS classes that have either a colon or a double colon after them. So you might see you've got a class of container, and on that you've got like colon hover, right? That's called a pseudo class, and that is, hey, here's our cat. That is a way of attaching styles to a browser-specific hook, whereas a pseudo element is going to be prefixed with a double colon, and it's going to look like this. So container after or container before. Before and after are really the two pseudo elements that are most commonly seen in web development. There are a couple other small ones. I'm not hugely familiar with them, but these are like the two main ones that we use kind of on a regular basis. And what these do is they actually create an element on the page via your CSS. So if we came up here and I added a div that has a class of container, and I said there is an h1 inside this that says hello world, right? If I can spell that correctly. Oh, there's my first save. There we go. All right, we're back. All right, so hello world. You can see on the left-hand side we have that hello world there. And I'm going to go ahead and inspect this area, and we're going to play with CodePen and get the sizes right for y'all. All right, let's see if I can increase that. And then we'll come in and we will inspect that div. So there is currently just a div class container in that h1, as we've seen in our HTML. Inside of our CSS, we're going to add a property called the content property, and it has to have some sort of value to make a pseudo element work. The pseudo element won't actually be rendered into the DOM without some form of content inside. So for now, we're just going to say hello back world. And as you can see now in our text over here on the left, we have hello back world above our h1, and over here in our DOM we have a before element that is right before the h1. Now what this means is a couple things. First and foremost, before and after are a before and after content of an element. So if you were expecting this to be outside of that container element, you would be unfortunately mistaken on that. So that's going to go right before the content, and then if we did an after, so dot container after, and we said the content of this was yo. This comes right after the h1, and this is the same if there was any amount of content in our container. So in this case, we'll go and add an h3. This is an h3, And as you can see, once it reloads and I inspect again, inside of our div class container, it goes before, h1, h3, and after. So this is the very first thing inside of our container is going to be the pseudo element before, and the very last thing inside of our container is the pseudo element after. So I hope that's all making sense. That's kind of one of the trickier elements. You have to have content, and the great thing about content is it also takes a blank string and is perfectly happy with that. So you can see over here in my left-hand side, I've got hello back world, hello world, this is an H3, and then nothing, but rendered into the DOM is that after element. It just so happens that it has no content inside. But if I went ahead and specified a width and a height, and let's give it a background color, blue. Oops. I thought I was working inside of CodePen, but there we go. Let's see. And then display block, that's going to give us the element in there. Now, by default, a pseudo element is actually display inline block. And so we do have to change that over to block and give it a display value to make it actually show up on the page when we don't have content inside of it. So this is all well and good. We can add content to the page using a pseudo element, but that's not really all that handy, because for the most part you do want your real content to be inside of your markup, inside of your HTML. Otherwise, it's not necessarily accessible to people with screen readers or anything like that. So it's an accessibility concern if you put real content inside of one of these elements. A lot of screen readers do render or do read the content of these, so you do also have to be careful in that direction, but it's kind of inconsistent. Not every screen reader is going to do that. So I'm going to show a couple design patterns that I happen to like with this methodology, and I'm going to start real simple, and I'm going to introduce a new selector called an attribute selector. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to say I've got an anchor, it's got an href of I have no clue if this is not an actual thing on my site, but we'll make it an href brianlrobinson.com/whitepaper.pdf, right? Because I must have white paper somewhere. I don't. So it doesn't matter. This doesn't actually have a PDF at the end of it. We just need that kind of in there. I'm going to say download my white paper, right? So I have this this link over here. Theoretically, when I click that, it's going to go to a PDF. So I might want to actually let a sighted user know that this is going to be a download. And you can do that with an icon, but I'm actually going to come in. Let's get rid of DevTools real fast. I'm going to actually search the page. I'm going to say if there's an anchor that has an href that, see if I can remember my regex, href that ends with .pdf, I want you to have an after on that, after, that is just going to have content, and we're going to say parentheses PDF, right? Because we're going to let the user know that this is a PDF. Save that in. I'm terrible with my selectors. There it is. Okay. So as you can see now, I have looking for an anchor that has an href that ends with the string .pdf. So if I had 50 links on this page, so let's say this was a CMS editable page, say you've got WordPress or something else that allows you to embed a link to a file, this would allow for us to let the user know that any link on the page that has .pdf at the end of it is a PDF. Now we also need to add a space in there. Otherwise, you can see we didn't have a space on this left-hand side. So this allows us to actually append a little bit of content relationally to this element. I actually did it on my own site when I actually launched the office hours link on it. I didn't want to go in and add like a new tag on that, so I actually created a class of new and actually added that as text after. And you can do anything that you want to stylistically to this text that you could do with regular text on the page. So we could say I want the color to be red, and I want the font size to be 0.6 of that. So we can make it really, really small. We can make it stylistic. You could also insert background images. You can do all sorts of stuff along those lines. So this is one really, really handy way of utilizing it. You can attach it to a class, to an attribute selector, to any element on the page, really, and then insert a little bit of content at the end of a link like this. You could also put, instead of a bit of text, if you wanted to have an icon, you could actually set the background image to like an SVG icon and then set your height and width on it, and it would add that to the end as well. Another potential use case for this, let's come in, let's make a new area, is in, say, like a footer navigation, right? So I could have, or maybe a copyright area at the bottom. So we could have our div copyright, and it could have, you know, this is copyrighted 2016, or what year is this? 2019 for, you know, code contemporary. And then I could have in here, you know, a pipe and then like terms of service or that sort of thing, right? This is a fairly common design pattern. But that pipe is just a pipe in the text, and that's not necessarily something that we want a screen reader to see, or really any other types of users. Sorry, cat knocked the mic. Might not be able to really get in there, and it has to be read aloud, which is kind of disconcerting. So we can actually come in and we could add maybe a couple spans around this. So span class equals copyright item, and we'll do that around both of them. And so one of the things you could do here is you could have a border that would do this as well, but then you have to go in and it's a whole thing, right? So we'll span there, and then this one will have the same span around it, slash span, and then in our copyright item we could have an after element before, or sorry, an after element here that is content of, you know, pipe space, and then also specify that this is going to show that you can stack any of your pseudo selectors and pseudo classes. So we also want this to be an nth child, or sorry, last child. We want the last child after to replace the content of that pipe with no content whatsoever. So it's going to find the last child, do something to its after element, and in this case we're going to revert from being a pipe to being a blank string. So again, all kind of handling around content, but the great thing about how this works is that it doesn't have to be. So we're going to talk about how to add a background overlay on top of a background image. So I do have a blog post about this and another video covering it. Links are both in the description down below to find out more about that. But we're going to talk about it real fast. Why do you even have that JavaScript open? So we're going to come in here. We're going to say we've got a banner. Why did I put that there? We need a section banner. Inside of here we'll have an H1. This is our awesome banner. Right? Fairly common design pattern. You'd have a big background image on this. Let's do a couple simple styles to make it look kind of like you'd expect it. So we'll say it needs a height, and again I usually maybe use padding, but just to be quick we'll say it's got a 90 VH height, and it has a background image. Let's use CodePen's assets and find a good image. Let's see. Hey, it's a cat. Okay, that kind of fits our theme today of having cats interrupt us. So we'll come in, add that background image, URL, background size cover. All right, so now we have a 100 or 90 VH background image, and we've got our text inside of it. And just for my own sake, we're going to say this is display flex, and we're going to say margin auto on our H1, because I need this to work like that sometimes. All right, and we'll give it a color of white for now so we can see everything. So a fairly common design pattern, big background image, text on top of it. But as you can see, oftentimes the text gets a little hard to read, right? So I've got right around here, it starts getting hard and blending in with the cat's kind of light area on his or her face there. So I could change the color around. I could change it to black, but as you saw earlier, black blends in even worse. So let's leave it at white. And now I want to go ahead and add an overlay between our background image and our foreground content. Now I could do that by literally coming in, and I could set a div up here of banner overlay. It would come in here, but it would be a part of the DOM already, and that's kind of a weird thing to add markup for a stylistic element like this. And so instead of doing that, I'm going to go to our banner. We're going to go out of the HTML, and I'm going to add a banner. We'll do a before on this just so we can see kind of the differences. And again, nothing happens when there's a before or an after element added until you add content. So we're going to add content of blank, and that's just not going to insert any content onto the page. We're going to make it display block, and then I'm going to make it position absolute, and I'm going to have it be a height 100% and width 100% to make it fit the full bounds of our rectangle. So position, let's go ahead and set the height and width. Height 100%, width 100%. And we will say, and you can see it starts pushing things out of the way because that's Flex trying to make things fit there. So I'm going to take it out of the natural flow of the document by using position absolute. Now it's behind everything, or on top of everything actually. And we'll go ahead and set a background color of light blue. So we now have a pseudo element that is one big background color, but it's in front of everything. And that's because of the way that position absolute ends up working. It pulls it out of the flow and puts it on top of everything. So we're going to come in and we're going to go ahead and specify our other banner content to have a position and a z index. So we'll say dot banner direct descendant of anything. And again, if you had some classes, you could make this work as well. So we're going to give it a position relative. And you can see it already comes in on top because we are using a before element. It just needs to be positioned. You could use an after, and oftentimes I use an after just to make sure that in terms of screen readers that it's always read after, but I wanted to show that off a little bit. Position relative automatically brings it into the flow of its positioned friends. And then we also need position relative on our banner. What that's going to do is make the before element take its position from the banner itself. And we can say we want top 0, left 0. And you'd really need to do that if you were using an after instead of a before, because it would actually be positioned down where it started. So this is great, but we don't have our background image anymore, which is a bit of a problem when we're talking about using this just as an overlay to augment our background. So I'm going to set an opacity on this of, let's say, 0.4. And now you can see it is now on top of our background image, and we can change this from light blue to a dark gray. And now we can use that to actually augment the text to make it readable no matter what. So we have, this is our awesome banner on top of that background. And now if we go in, oops, hot corners. If we go into assets and let's choose, this is probably going to be pretty awesome. Let's choose this image instead, since it's all very white, and let's put it in here. Let that load in. So now if we didn't have this before, so let's comment out the content, this would end up being really hard to read, even though it wasn't too hard to read on that cat picture. But with our before element, it is now something that you can very easily read, and you can adjust your opacity to match your needs. And the cool thing is you can also use this with a background image of really of anything. So if you wanted to overlay a different background image, or if you want to do a linear gradient on top of it, you could do that as well. You could say background image, because that's what a linear gradient is. It's actually an image on the page. Linear gradient. Let's see if I can get the syntax right from the start. We could say we want this to be from transparent, let's see, to top, from transparent, or from black to transparent. So now we actually have this gradient, and we can actually position, if we want the H1 to be at the bottom, we can actually say margin top auto, and there is the bottom with that gradient coming in. Now you can specify different stops to make the gradient exactly what you'd expect it to be. You could also have it go from one color to another, but this gives you that idea of like a shadow kind of coming up on top of it, which can also be nice. You could also then go and adjust your margins to have it not be flush against the left-hand side there. And just so we can see it a little better, because I know that might be at the bottom of your screen, let's go ahead and add some margin to the banner. Margin bottom, 20 rem, just so we can scroll down to it. Now you can see we have a nice gradient that comes in on top of it. I've used this kind of to good effect doing a lot of gradients on my personal site because it's a lot of fun for me to play around with that. Any questions? We've been going for about 20 minutes. I can show maybe my favorite use of pseudo elements and the attribute hook in CSS to put some extra content on the page, but I want to make sure I stop. These are all the basics. We're going to do one advanced, and then we're going to call it a day. So any questions on pseudo elements right now? If you've got tea or coffee, now it's time to sip it too. Okay. This might be that there is a delay, but there's no questions right now, so I'm going to move on. And we're going to look at one more interesting way of handling this, and that is to create a custom tooltip with 0 JavaScript. 0 JavaScript gets you a custom tooltip for any item. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to specify a new class of tooltip. And we're going to add that to our H3 up here. Class equals tooltip. And I'm going to add a title to our H3. So I'm going to give it a title attribute, and we're going to say this is a custom tooltip for an H3 on the page. All right, so just some content. It doesn't display on the screen. It is going to be read to a screen reader. So obviously you want this to be for both use cases, for a cited use case and for a non-cited use case. Or this needs to be something that can be easily found in either case. So we're going to actually come in and we're going to specify an after pseudo element down here on the tooltip, and we're going to give it a content, and we're going to use a new method in CSS. It's actually a pretty old method, and it is relatively well supported. It's the attr method, which is the attribute method, and you can give it any attribute in HTML to grab off of the element and put here. So we're going to say we want the title attribute to be the content of this element. And as you can see, it automatically comes in on the page. So up here, this is a custom tooltip for an H3 on the page. I hover over the H3. I also get that in the browser specific hover state. So I can also specify a couple other things. I can say this is going to have a position absolute, because we want it to be outside the flow of the document, and I'm going to want it positioned above the H3 for when a user hovers. So I'm going to say my tooltip is position relative, because it needs to be a positioned element for absolute to work properly. We're going to say bottom 100% to get up above the content, and we're going to say left 100%. Oops, that's not what I meant. Left 0 is what I meant. So now it's above and anchored on the left-hand side. Again, you can kind of work with this however you need to. It is display inline block, so it is going to have those kind of inline elements to it. We can make it display block if we wanted to and give it a hard width. That would be something for your styling and not necessarily apropos to our demo today. So I'm also going to specify, let's give it a background color of light blue and a little bit of padding. And you know what, because I can't help myself, we'll give it a display block with calc 100% of its parent minus, let's call it 2 rem. And of course its parent, I suppose, is a full block level element, so that's there as well. So now we want to have this only take effect on hover. And like I showed you before, we can chain these selectors together, and we could say that when there's a tooltip that has been hovered, we want this to come in. So I come up here and I hover over my H3, and then there is our tooltip right there, ready to be read, ready to be consumed. So this gives us a lot of power. This could also be, instead of a title, if we wanted a data attribute of data-title, we could just specify that instead. So I hover over now. I do still get all those elements, the background, the size, and all that, but I'm now missing our title. Save that back in, and the data attribute comes in. So if you've got data attributes that you're using for JavaScript, you can use that here. If you want to just show maybe the href value of a link, you could do that with a tooltip. Obviously, titles are going to be a big use case for this, but that is kind of one of those advanced maneuvers with pseudo elements. You can actually bring in content from an attribute on your HTML, which is super handy in a lot of different ways. So that is kind of the basics of using a pseudo element in CSS. You have to specify content, whether that's a blank string or an actual piece of content or an attribute selector. You have to do that. You need to specify oftentimes display block or a display value if you're doing something that is not going to be content on the page. And then you can use any other CSS value you want to make things work. I've used this to add quotations around a block quote, so I don't actually have those big bulky ones. I don't want those to be images on the page. A before or an after actually takes an element inside, say, flex, and so you actually have a flex value of 1 for that middle column, and then left and right hand side you could have a before and an after, putting quotation marks on there, and they actually take space inside that flex element or inside of a grid. So if you specify display grid, before and after actually take space in that grid as well, unless you specify position absolute to bring them outside of it. So there's a lot of applications. There's a lot of cool things you can do. I'm planning a course right now on doing these exact things and the power of pseudo elements. So if you go to the links below, there's a link to sign up for a newsletter for specifically the pseudo powers, I think what I'm calling it, course. It's going to be just like my CSS grid course, a couple hours, lots of practical examples for getting you started with pseudo elements. These will be in there, but then we're going to get a little bit more complicated, do a few more cool things with them. So definitely hit up that link below and sign up for that, because there's also probably going to be a sign up bonus, maybe a 50% off or something like that, to make it worth your while to sign up for that email. And as always, I still have Practical CSS Grid. It's at codecontemporary.com. You can find out more. And then brianlrobinson.com has lots of great blog posts on things ranging from pseudo elements to some thought pieces I've been doing on the role of HTML and the role of kind of how we learn things back in the day, and how we can continue pushing forward into new spaces with that maybe even older methodology. So I'd love it if you went and read a few of those things, maybe share them with your friends. Definitely click the subscribe and an alert button down below so that you can find out when I'm going live every week, as well as when I launch new videos. And unless there are any other questions, I'm going to call this a day and say everyone have a great week and weekend, and I'll see you next week.